Well, with us today is Miller H. Caldwell, author of 28 books, drawn from a life rich and varied. And he's joining us from Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland today. The son of a preacher man, as it were, also a missionary, one time educational social worker, regional reporter to children's hearings, sportsman, musician, ventriloquist, poet, film script writer, and writer in residence at Dumfries Prison. And there's more, international research panelist and camp manager in Pakistan. It's an incredible life, Miller. Firstly, welcome and thank you for joining us, as indeed you, John. John Costa is also with us. Thanks, gents, for joining us. What I'd like to do is, if I may, take you back, Miller, 15 years and ask you how you came to be in an earthquake zone in the mountains of northwest Pakistan.
Yes, you might think that's rather unusual because most of my humanitarian work was in West Africa. I had a friend in the police force in Dumfries and Galloway, and he also ran a restaurant. His name was Farouk Ahmed. And sadly, he had lost his nephew in an earthquake. And he knew I'd just retired. I'd taken ill at the age of 53, retired from being regional reporter to the children's panels, the Scottish legal system, to attend to children with difficulties. So he said, could I go out and help the children? So I gave this some thought and thought, what do I do? How could I entertain children? I've got a puppet, I've got a mouth organ, I got paper, I got string, put it all together. My wife said, yes, go if you want to go. And I went. And I went with all that baggage, stopped at Heathrow because I had some metal piece in the bottom of my case, which they found out was a mouth organ. Same story in Islamabad. What's this you've got here? And it was a mouth organ. Had to play them to both authorities. Some applause in Islamabad, I should say. In Heathrow, they just thought, mouth organ, right. Anyway, I got out there, but I wasn't the camp manager. And what happened was there was a meeting on day 2, and it was outside, and it was January, and there had been snow. The snow had melted, and there was mud, and it was cold. There was a wind. It was miserable. And there were about 8 of us in a circle. And the meeting was held by a brigadier of the Pakistani army. And it was a very serious meeting because what had happened was the land that had been donated for this camp was owned by a farmer and his wife. And it was alleged she had donated some of the goods to the local people who were not affected by the earthquake. And this was a very serious matter. However, I stuck up my hand and said, I have some sympathy for this lady because when there's a world disaster, the world responds immediately. But what you don't have in position is an organization, a system for distribution of that aid. And I said, this is the situation that's befallen this lady. And she had to have an outing for this. She didn't hoard it herself. She gave it to other people who were not particularly wealthy. I have sympathy for her. And the brigadier pointed at me and he said, you're not a Muslim. And I thought, no. He said, you're independent. I said, yes. I make you the camp manager. So that's, at the end of my mouth, well, it wasn't the end of the mouth organ nor the string, but it was a different job entirely. And I was responsible 24/7, every hour of every day in that camp as a result.
So what was it like? What did you find at this particular camp? I mean, no experience of running a camp before, refugees pouring in, people in all kinds of conditions who have suffered all kinds of trauma. What was it like?
You're right about everything except one thing you said, the people were not coming in, and it was partly because the government prevented people joining camps. And I sort of turned a blind eye to that when you got a husband who had been in hospital with a broken arm, and he found out where his family were. It was after this cutoff date. I knew his family were in the camp. I would let him in. Now, physically, it really was muddy, a real caked mud, a reddish mud everywhere. And it was difficult to trudge through this. And yet you would come across children with bare feet. And this was distressing. We really had to get as many clothes as we could possibly get. And we made appeals to the aid distribution centers in Islamabad, where Farooq Ahmed, my Dumfries friend, was working and distributing much of the aid that was coming in. So there's a lovely moment about getting the blankets out, because British Airways had sent a whole lot of tartan blankets. Now, I made the mistake by giving one fellow, I said, this is the Robertson tartan. Ah, Robertson, I said, it's a family name in Scotland, this is their tartan. Off he went, and all the people I'd given the blankets to came back. What is this tartan? What is this tartan? What is this tartan? So that was a real problem to begin with, but it was a fun one anyway. It was a real test of my Scottish knowledge.
It sounds to me like you're the right man for the right job at the right time, even if you didn't mean to be there. And so I think that's one of the things, certainly reading the documents you sent through, and the conversations I've had with Andy, with his own experiences on the humanitarian side, sometimes what you originally go for ends up not being what you end up doing, because people recognize other things in you. And I think that's almost quite inspired from that Pakistani army brigadier to realize that, you know, maybe the fact that you were a humanitarian that was advocating for this woman rather than being hung, drawn and quartered because of some transgression she had done. In fact, the humanity of it came through, and he explained it as an independent, but I would almost say, well, as a humanitarian, you're the best person to run that camp.
It's kind of you to say that. Of course, with the children not speaking Urdu, I had a problem. We had a teacher, and she kept the boys separate from the girls, but she gave me access to the girls' class. One of the things I would do, of course, you've probably seen this, you know, you've got a finger on either side. Anyway, that went down extremely well. And of course, they tried to do it. I had to teach them. And then they went to their parents and said, look what this white man has taught us. And little things like that. And ventriloquism was a great thing. But I mean, it was a more responsible job being the camp manager. We had disputes. Because the ground was tiered and the tents had been put up on each tier, when the rain came, unless you had created a little barrier with the mud to prevent the rain coming through to the next level, that would happen. And I heard of a report of a riot going on up the north end of the camp. So I got up there to find Kalashnikovs pointing at each other. And I said, hang on, we're not going to solve this with these things, put them down. And I had a translator, obviously. I said, we could stay here and talk and let the water go, or we could build up this dam and prevent any more water. So they agreed to that, and they both joined in to do that, and the problem was solved. But there's a bit of standing off and proving their point that they've got to have. And unfortunately, there were far too many guns in the camp. But who was I to take them away as long as they weren't being used? I set an example by showing I had one, but never walked around with it. There was night security when he wasn't a policeman, but he did have uniform, and he patrolled the camp at night. There was hardly any need, but he was there anyway. Distribution of food was, of course, crucial. And I've got one photo I think you've probably seen where we're about to distribute the food. Dates from Saudi Arabia in their boxes with the Saudi flag. And behind them, USA, what was in there? Oh, there was rice, there was all sorts of things in there. They sort of packed them in bags and they came out in boxes. So all this had to be distributed. When we distribute them, preventing people coming back, they had to sign for it. Now, what I found interesting was the younger people used their thumb to sign for receiving the goods. But the older fellows tended to ask for a pen and they signed themselves. That's perhaps harking back to the Raj system many years ago when schooling was very, fairly prominent, and schooling was a bit like the British schooling. You learned to read and write.
So Miller, can I just ask you, I mean, how many people were you responsible for in this camp?
24,500.
Oh.
So it was a lot of aid. And most people got on with each other because they were all in the same circumstances. They were not all, they didn't know each other, not all knew each other, many did. And I divided the camp into 5 areas, A, B, C, D, E, very simple. And I said to the farmer's son, we need to give an award to see if we can improve the standard of hygiene, the standard of cleanliness in each of these areas. So we went off to the town and we got this beautiful cup. I mean, you could hold it in one finger. It wasn't the FA cup. It was a fairly light cup, but that would do, you see. So we took this back and we showed them this, the winning camp would get this. And it was camp number B that got it. And they were thrilled, but they weren't going to hand it back for the next month's or the next week's inspection. So we almost ran out of these cups. But that's one way to improve the system.
So Miller, can I ask you, I mean, you're talking about the camp and the size of the camp and stuff, and you know that you were new to this kind of role, and you touched on at the beginning your previous experience of doing things in West Africa. Just give us an example of what sort of things you were doing over there. Were there camps like that, or was it a very kind of different type of work that you were doing?
It was entirely different, although there was a very poor area, shanty town, and we cleared the drains. We got a team to get involved in clearing them. It meant the rats wouldn't be there. That was one thing. We got the hospital, which had no kitchen. There was no food. If you went to a hospital and you were in the bed and you were there for a few days, the family had to provide the food. So we took over the hospital land and we grew onions, cassavas, bananas, plantain, all sorts of food, which we could then say belonged to the hospital. Therefore, they could be given to the people. That was one thing. It was 2 things. The third thing was the government started a program called Operation Feed Yourself. It sounded good on paper, but it meant that it took some farm workers to areas to help cultivate the land. But one group of people were given a very arid bit of land, and it really wasn't very productive. And when the soldiers realized they weren't doing much, they took out their batons and hit them, told them to work harder. And they were in a dreadful situation. I was asked to go out there by one of their relatives who I knew in Tema. And at the same time, I'd heard of a pesky old German who ran the rubber estate in the west of the country. And it was so inland that he couldn't keep his people there. There was good money. At the end of the week, they would disappear, get drunk and never return. So I contacted him and I said, I've got 16 farm workers here and they would like to work with you. And he said, oh, they'll never stay. So we got them on board a bus. They went over to the Western region and they stayed there for more than a year. And one of them came back on his leave and brought me a monkey. He said that its parent had been shot for food, but the baby was retained and they gave it to us as a present. So we had a monkey as well as a parrot. And by that time I had a wife.
What country was that, Miller?
That was Ghana, West Africa.
In Ghana. Okay, so you've got this experience in Ghana of doing that kind of work, and then you've appeared in this camp, and you're talking about sort of, you know, like you said, the guns and sort of stuff. But you've seen a very different side of Pakistan that most people will have seen or heard or read about, or, you know, watched on television. Really, I mean, what's your overriding impression of the people?
Well, before I get on to the people, I only saw Islamabad on my way back. I arrived in Islamabad and I was whisked up to the northwest area, frontier province, and it was only a couple of days I had in Islamabad before I went home. I had meetings at Muslim Hands in Islamabad, and I was driven around the place. And of course, it was a city that was built in, 68 or so it's a modern city.
Right.
And I looked at the road junctions, and they had these lights. They weren't red, orange, and green. They had numbers on them. It started with 30 seconds, 29, 28. It got down to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Now, if we had that in Britain, there would be far a few people hanging onto their wheels and getting neurotic, having heart attacks, waiting to get away from the lights. So there's one thing that Pakistan really had, which we didn't. And the shops were amazing. You could get probably anything there. And of course, I wasn't used to that in the Northwest.
I think if I could just come in there, Miller, I think the interesting thing about Islamabad is that, I mean, all the locals love it. They describe it. It's this kind of El Dorado. It's Islamabad, the beautiful. And it's like this kind of bubble, because immediately you travel out of Islamabad and you're into Pakistan. Islamabad is not typical of Pakistan. It was, as you say, purpose-built, you know, on the slopes of the first fold of the Himalayas, next to Rawalpindi, the big military garrison town. And, you know, a bespoke city, you know, built in the late 60s to a grid system, very organized. And of course, it draws people from far and wide as this golden city. But yeah, it's a very strange kind of place. It's very Western. It's very liberal by comparison. But then you go into the mountains, and it's a bit of a culture shock. And one of the things that I found interesting about, you know, listening to you talking, is that in a way you were kind of like almost in Pakistan on a whim, almost there by accident. And suddenly you're propelled into this role of being responsible for 28,000 people running a camp. And it's a similar story that I had. I went out on a 10-day journalistic assignment for my local newspaper, and just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and was offered work for this incredible story in a small tribal area known as the Black Mountain, which you've read about, and John, you've read about it too, which is featured in the book. But then things just seemed to take a life of their own, as if suddenly you were being directed to new experience, and you just happened to be the right person for the right job. Very strange, and very strange too, in that, I don't know about you, Miller, but I was quite naive. I didn't know anything about Pakistan when I went out, really. And in a way, that naivety, that simplicity, that lack of any prejudgment worked in my favor. Not least of all because I never, ever felt in any danger. Although, of course, as we know, Pakistan is a dangerous place. So it's kind of very strange how these things happen. And John, you touched on it as well, that sometimes you can be in this, you know, in a particular circumstance, and then things just seem to take their own, you know, momentum, really. So it's very, very strange. But so Miller, how long were you there for in the Northwest?
Well, I arrived the first week of January, and I left in the middle of March, partly because the government wanted to close the camps. But one thing I should go back to, just to clarify, you mentioned 28,000, it was 24,500 people. But how did I cope? Well, the farmer had two sons. One was older than the other, obviously. And the younger one followed me around because his English was excellent. So I was able to have a translator by my shoulder all the time. And the reason I left, partly because I was aware that my visa would have to be extended, because I only had a working visa. It said humanitarian worker, but it nevertheless meant 3 months. But the government wanted to, while the better weather was about to come, get the people out of the camps, all the camps, get them back to their home areas, just try and particularly get the food growing again, and to try and build their houses again in the summer that was about to come. So they didn't want the farm to be turned into cemented buildings and a more substantial camp. It remained tents all the time. And that's why I had to say my farewells.
But you're absolutely right, Miller. I mean, I remember it as well. There was this obsession by the government to drive the people out of the camps back to their points of origin. And really, the issues that we found, and I say we, I was working for World Vision at that time, which was as a large international NGO, as I'm sure you know, was that the people had nothing to go back to, Some of these villages in the mountains were literally razed 100% to rubble. And so there was nothing. And there were issues over any kind of state support or compensation packages. It was very slow getting to the people, and then there were all kinds of conditions about reconstruction, but this was the problem, was that the families would return having left under terrible circumstances, and returning to what they'd left, which was in effect nothing, because it had all been destroyed, with very little support to sustain families. So yeah, that I remember that too.
They had 3 months in the camp during which they bonded, and at the end, there really was a good bond between the different people, which implied that, not that we would ever forget the earthquake, but they'd survived, and they'd been fed, and they'd been clothed, and they'd been given comfort to a certain level. And then the government said it was time to go. And of course, there weren't all 24,500 going different ways. They were going in village communities setting off. So there was I don't want to say camaraderie, it's not a very Pakistani thing, but it was like that. They knew each other. Not Pakistani word, I should say. And that was one sort of area of light you could have. But really, you're right, there was no support. And on paper, they were told that they had to go back, the better weather was coming, they'd be able to grow things. And on paper, that seemed right. But when they got back, it was different. The camps were closed.
Obviously, one of the things that people tend to have a preconception of is Pakistan as a country, and almost a mistrust, if you like, of the people, different religion, different culture. But in terms of your interactions with the people, what was your impression of the people that you managed in the camp, the people that you oversaw, in a desperate condition, obviously, at various points. But what was your general kind of impression of the people and the culture?
Well, good question. At the end of the day, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns, is a local expression. In other words, we're all the same.
Yeah.
And that was seen time and time again. There's a picture in the book, I think you probably got it even in the article I sent, of me receiving chapati in a bakery. Now, straight off the pan, that's the hottest thing I've ever held. And I screamed out, and of course they all looked, and this was hilarious. the white man's hands were soft compared with our, we could carry anything that's hot. So that was a moment where, they saw the problem, they saw it was funny, and they laughed because they're human. And over it was like that. We had a group of medics who came to the camp, and they were from Cuba. And
I heard about those guys. Yeah.
Well, one of them was, oh gosh, what was her name? Anyway, she fell in love with Jahir, who's the farmer's son. And they came to me and they said, would it work? And I said, well, your government has sent you out and they're expecting you back. Does this mean he travels with you? How does that affect his family? Is it true love? And, you could see it in their eyes. There was definitely something there. And of course, when this got out, the Cuban leader, the doctor in charge, really came down on her to prevent this happening. But when they were leaving, we had a meeting at the farmhouse with the Cuban doctors, the local family, and some of my senior staff were there. And it was a sticky meeting because of the language. But I turned to the Cubans and said, Guantanamera, Guajira, Guantanamera. And suddenly they all lit up and they started singing and dancing in the front of this farmhouse. And they were thrilled that someone knew it. And one of the Pakistanis stood up and started to dance to this. And that encouraged the others. And it turned out to be an amazing thing. And it shows music can generate such camaraderie amongst people.
They're the things that bring us all together, aren't they? The things that we share. I've just got this fantastic vision in my head of this young couple deeply in love coming to you and going, Miller, you're independent. Will it work? and then forever since then, people just turning up on your door, you're independent. Will this work? Should I grow this?
I've not continued that, no. But we used to have lunch in chetties in some local villages around by, and we went to a few of them, and we got to see the strange white man who always attended these, and they were most filling. Little plates, little metal plates, and some stew on it with a chapati. And to begin with, my pieces of chapati weren't big enough to pick up the bits and pieces, so I was told to make it bigger and keep the left hand out of the way.
So Miller, there's obviously a really interesting person that you met, and I'm going to leave that to Andy to do that. Okay, so I'm going to ask you about someone else that I'm quite keen for you to talk about. Is the person Farouk Ahmed, who actually was the person that told you about the disaster, and he'd lost his niece, and that he was going, and would you go with him? I mean, are you still in touch with him? What was he when you came back? What kind of relationship have you had with him going forward?
We were interviewed by the BBC together. When he was out in Pakistan, I saw him when I arrived and when I left. And he has since left the police, left his restaurant, and has moved to Luton. So we're in email contact these days. In fact, he left many years ago to go to Luton, where he had relatives as well. And he's in business now down there. But yes, he was the one who instigated it all. Of course, my wife, who's 69, is still working with the police as a civilian. She's in charge. Well, what does she do? She's a computer expert. So she's working at home just now.
Let's hope she doesn't watch this, so she realizes you don't know what she does. That's all. We don't want to be the ones that get you in trouble.
Thank you.
My final point, and then I think Andy will pick up on obviously this really interesting character that you met. But for me, it's interesting that Farouk mentions to you about the situation, and then you end up going there, and Andy saw the report by Peter Foster, the journalist who we interviewed a couple of weeks ago, that Andy's still in touch with. It's amazing, isn't it, that people come across these different reasons, whether it's still a story that someone's either done a journalistic report or has mentioned a personal connection to it, which in us, and I've had several of these in my life, you suddenly think, I need to do something about that. Maybe if not me, who? Then you think, well, I'm going to go and do it. And it's amazing the impact that these kind of situations have on our life. But
so true. Yeah.
So Andy, over to you.
Yeah, one of the things I can't let you go without talking about Miller is your confrontation, your meeting with Osama bin Laden. Tell me a little bit about that, because as I understand it, you became quite ill at one point with flu, and you kind of had to be transferred to Mansera. But I wonder if you could tell us what happened and tell us a little bit about that story.
Okay. Well, before I left, I would have joined everybody in thinking Osama bin Laden was in a cave in Afghanistan. But when I got out there, I got this sort of flu bug, and I was as weak as could be. And that's when they said, look, you've got to rest, you've got to leave the camp. And they found a building called, it was run by the Muslim Hands Eye Clinic. And I was downstairs in one of the rooms and on a flat bed, recovering. And after about a couple of days, my energy really did perk up and I was feeling much better. May have been 3 days, but I've been saying 2 for so long, it might have been 3. And there was an area in front of this building before the wall, and the car had come in to the drive, and I didn't hear it park, but I heard the 2 car doors close. And there weren't many cars that came to the clinic, so I parked up a wee bit. And then there was a shout at the front of the door, so I came out. And although it was a ground floor, I was 2 steps up, and I was standing on them. And there were 2 people. There was one man who was fairly short, but this man was at least my height, and I was 2 solid steps up. The tallest Pakistani I had ever seen. There was no doubt about it. And salam alaikum, bitikum salam, you know, we got through the greetings fine. And he looked at me and he could see my skin was, although I had the beard and I had the right Pakistani attire, it was probably a little bit whiter than most Pakistanis. And he said, who are you? And I said, I was the camp manager at Mundihar. And he nodded, and he asked of someone I'd never heard of, and I told him I didn't know who he was. I said I was recovering from flu. Now, his English was different from Pakistanis. It was very well educated. And he said, where are you from? And I said, Scotland. And as soon as I said Scotland, he turned and hobbled as quickly as he could get back to the car. It was a blue 4-door car, got into it and ducked down, and the car left and turned towards Abbottabad. So later that day, I had some visitors from the camp, and I said, I'm pretty sure I met Osama bin Laden, and he was heading off to Abbottabad. And this was the 6th of February. 2006, and they said, oh yeah, you saw him, did you? And I said, did you know he was here? Oh, he comes to Mundihar, he's been in the market there. Oh yes, several people, we know him, yes, he's been around. And I said, well, you know, if you captured him and gave him to the Americans, you'd probably be quite wealthy. And he said, why would we do that? And I said, well, it's just, I suppose, a Westerner speaking. He said, but it was payback time. The Americans had done this, had done that, and we were always at the end of that. And we feel, all right, we got even. Now, of course, it's a horrible thing, what happened in 12/11. But not 12/11, what am I talking about?
9/11.
9/11, yes. That was seen as an entirely different perspective on this man. So I said no more about him until I got home. I went to see the chief constable, who I knew very well, David Strang, and I told him where Osama bin Laden was. He was almost certainly living in Abbottabad. And I also told my MP on another day, separately, Russell Brown MP, exactly the same thing, how I'd met him. I told my wife, and she couldn't believe it. But both of them said he was in an Afghan cave, and implied I was deluded or something. Well, 2011 came, and the US SEALs found him in Abbottabad, and they killed him, and he was buried at sea, according to strict Islamic laws. And they had revealed he had been in Abbottabad since 2006, which is when I met him, when everyone else said he was in an Afghan cave. And therefore, I realized there was never any doubt in my mind. One, he was the tallest man I'd ever seen in Pakistan. Two, his English was perfect, unlike every Pakistani I'd met. What was the third thing?
Well, of course, he's more Arabic in appearance as well, because, of course, he's a native, or was a native of Saudi, wasn't he? So a very different kind of law.
He spent some time in Sweden as well, so very Western outlook to some extent.
Miller, we've talked a lot about, circumstance and kind of things happening, but I wonder, it strikes me that both of us really kind of decided, for whatever reason, to go out and do something. What would you say to other people that may look at, the sorts of problems that there are in the world and want to do something? I mean, both you and I have actually decided, sometime almost on a whim, I mean, it was for me, to go and do something, and then something extraordinary has happened. These sort of boundaries that you imagine in your head beforehand seem to fall away, and circumstances propel you forward for sort of unknown reasons. What would you say to people that actually, might want to do something, go out somewhere, do some volunteering, support people in need? What would you say to them?
Well, my wife was like that. She was a chemist with Beecham's doing preparatory medicines. She decided she hadn't done enough with her life. She decided she would go to VSO, and she asked to go to India, and they sent her to Ghana, and that's where I met her. But I think it goes back many years before. I grew up in a manse, and I had a father who was a Church of Scotland minister, and his wife, my mother, was the practical one. He was the one who did the marriages, the funerals, the weekly services. And mother used to get the down and outs who would come to the house, and she would give them a meal in the back garden, and some of these down and outs would weed the path, doing something in return. Others just were grateful to have something to eat, and off they went. And I thought, that's what Christianity is about. Now, I'd say now I'm not a Christian, but in those days, that left an indelible mark in my mind. It's what service was about. So I'd have to be honest with you. I was sexually abused by a school captain, and he lived 2 streets away. I wanted to get back every day from school a different way. I'd delay going back to school. I'd linger in the centre of Glasgow. I might go to a shop for half an hour, get a later train. I could get the bus. I could get one stop before I could get back. Now, I was a prize winner in first and second year, and they thought, oh, this guy's going places. Since then, I just wasn't concentrating. I had to avoid this man. I wasn't listening in class. I failed. Until he left school. He went to do history in York University. Now, that's great, but there again, there was Christmas, there was Easter. He was always back. And I thought, I've got to get out of Scotland. He's going to be teaching soon. He's going to be somewhere around. Now, this is the 60s. Sexual abuse was hidden. It wasn't discussed, but it had its effects. And that's one of the reasons I walked into the church, and I wasn't even a member of the church, and I wasn't even a member of the church, 121 George Street. I said, I'm a qualified social worker. It's a bit of paper. It's not a degree, it's a bit of paper, certificate. And they sent me to Ghana. It was in Ghana. I was playing rugby, believe it or not. There was a Welshman who said, let's play rugby. And we found out that the Ghanaian army played rugby. Most of the officers had been to Sandhurst or Mons, and they had learned the game and they were trying to instill it into the young soldiers. So we played with them. And we had internationals. We played against Nigeria and we played against Sierra Leone. So I got 2 international caps. One of the fellows who was on the sidelines was a fellow from London University. And we got chatting and I said, well, we're going to leave next year. And he said, what will you do? I said, well, I'm not too sure. May get into social work back in Scotland if my wife wants to come up to Scotland. She's at Lancastrian. He said, well, why don't you come to London University to SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies? I thought, 3 years, can I afford that? I said, I don't think I can spend 3 years in London. He said, oh, no, with your work experience, that's wonderful. I'll put you on the MA course, the postgraduate degree. It's only a year. So I thought a year sounds better. And so having failed everything at school, I end up with a postgraduate degree. That's how I got an MA. So going to Ghana was really about that, escapism. But it got the bug. And although I came back, I wanted to help children's lives. I became a reporter to the children's panels. And I suppose I've always been of that nature. Probably my mother was the biggest influence in her response to her Christian understanding of life.
I think it's really interesting as well, isn't it? Talking to young people, they're expected to conform so much these days. We give them a hard time about social media, or they're snowflakes, they're not interested. This generation could never fight World War II like this generation did. We're always giving them a hard time, but there's so much more pressure and the world is very different. And so teaching at the university, or when we're working with like primary school kids or secondary schools, most of the time that you're talking to them about the options that are available. And then they'll talk about the options from educational pathways. And you say, well, no, actually, it's options as in things that you can do in life that do need education or don't need education. And I think the story I always tell was my partner, Tina, took a group of young reporters when we ran a newspaper here with a local newspaper to the police headquarters. And there was a lady called Lou Cordner, and she was in charge of the police firearms unit and tactical dogs. And she said that she hated exams, and the kids were really shocked. And she said, school was a real challenge and all that. She said, what I learned was that whenever I wanted to progress, particularly in a man's world, she said, then I needed that piece of paper. I had to turn it on, and then I could turn it off afterwards. And I think we talk to young people about they need all these bits of paper, but not necessarily what is going to get them or the success. So they're on this pathway, and then they realize that it's not necessarily, they're not aiming for anything. We need to be talking about them. What is it they want to do and where they want to go? And I think overseas travel has been one of those things that's been lost, maybe post 9/11, as you mentioned, the complexity, and Andy mentioned almost like the naivety of thinking, well, actually, now I look back that Pakistan's a dangerous place. It's getting young people, and I think that's what drives me here at the Doc Media Centre, is getting people to understand that we're all the same. Everybody's the same. The only way you're going to find out what someone's like from any of that location, that sexuality, that faith, is to speak to them and educate yourself. Don't rely on the mainstream media to pick who you know and where you could go. And I think that's why your story is so powerful. And it's brilliant that you've shared it today, is because I think it's so relevant and speaks to people in whichever way they want, whether it's faith and a calling and public service, or whether it's an experience and adventure, or whether it's, doing good and humanitarian. It doesn't matter. It's go and have that experience, isn't it?
But what I would say as well is, and I'd like to say this, that I think you shouldn't be afraid to follow your conscience, follow your heart, follow your dreams as well. And you know, sometimes it's the boundaries we put in our own minds that stop us from doing certain things and from doing that. And I think, in my experience, and it sounds as though from your experience too, Miller, and yours, John, actually, that actually once you go out and take a step, then things often just kind of happen and fall into place, and not to be afraid, really, of stepping out, learning about the world. And of course, travel is a great educator in its own right. But no, remarkable stories, Miller. And I can't thank you enough for joining us. I know we could talk all day long because you've got stories and stories upon stories. You've led such a full and varied life. So, you know, I want to thank you for your time this morning, and perhaps we can talk again at some point in the very near future.
That'd be nice. Great to meet you on Zoom, I must say.
Yeah, it's great. I told you, I thought you were some kind of Highland guy with a bushy beard and a kilt, although, of course, you do have your own tartan and your own kilt.
Yes, we've got the McLean tartan, and I'm a 70-year-old toothless character these days.
Well, you are independent, so I'd believe whatever you said to me that tartan was, I'd believe you. So it's okay. It's good. That experience has followed you everywhere.
It has, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great pleasure, Miller. Thank you, and take care of yourself.
Thank you. Will do. Thanks.